Tell me, what's worse, being mocked by strangers or being mocked by your own family for simply living the way you choose? Have you ever had your independence mistaken for weakness? My name is Eleanor, and for 7 long years, I've lived in a house that once echoed with the warmth of love, laughter, and the sound of shared footsteps. My husband, Thomas, has been gone for all those years, leaving me to face the quiet of this home on my own. Some might call it lonely. I call it mine. The walls carry our story. Every corner holds a memory, and every creak of the floorboards reminds me of the life we built together. But if you ask my son David and his wife Brenda, they would tell you that I'm clinging to the past. That I'm being stubborn, reckless even, for choosing to live alone. They don't see strength in my independence. They see weakness, fragility, something to be corrected. To them, I'm a problem waiting to happen. David hides his opinions under a veil of concern. "Mom, it's just not safe," he says, his tone sharp with that false sympathy only a busy child gives to a parent when they want them out of the way. Brenda, however, doesn't even try to hide it. She pities me, loudly, almost theatrically. Poor Eleanor all by herself. She'll sigh at gatherings, making sure everyone hears. Her eyes always scanning the room as if to collect pity points from the audience. Their mockery isn't always in words. It's in the raised eyebrows when I mention fixing a leaky faucet on my own. It's in the way they pretend to be surprised when I show up at events, as if I'd crawled out of some dusty corner of history. To them, my choice to live in my own home, to keep my own rhythm, is not an act of strength, but a stubborn refusal to accept reality. But let me tell you something. Accepting their version of reality would mean surrendering my dignity. And I refuse. One afternoon, an envelope slid through my mail slot. It was thick, embossed, the kind that screams importance. Inside, I found an invitation, David and Brenda's 30th wedding anniversary. A grand affair at the Brookline Country Club. But what stung wasn't the gold lettering or the expensive venue. It was Brenda's handwritten note at the bottom. "Do try to make it, Eleanor. We know it's a big outing for you." A big outing for me? As though I were some fragile relic who couldn't manage the drive, who would get exhausted just stepping into a ballroom. The arrogance of it burned deep. They wanted a show, a reminder of the brave old woman still dragging herself along. Well, I decided then and there, they would get their show. But not the one they expected. Now, if you've ever been told you're too old or too weak, I hope you're subscribed, because women like us, we don't just listen to stories. We rise from them. And if you're not ready yet, that's okay. Head to the comments and tell me what's holding you back. That night, I sat in my living room staring at that invitation, the corners of the card gleaming under the lamp. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that most people would run from. But I've learned to live with silence. It has a rhythm of its own. Still, Brenda's words rang louder than any silence. "A big outing for you." As if my entire life had shrunk into a handful of safe steps from the kitchen to the bedroom. I thought of Thomas. He would have chuckled at their arrogance, squeezed my hand and whispered, "Show them, Emily." He always knew when I needed to be reminded of who I was, not just a mother, not just a widow, but a woman with fire in her bones. That fire had dimmed over the years, I admit. There are days when my knees ache so much that even walking to the garden feels like climbing a mountain. But weakness isn't defined by aching bones. Weakness is letting others decide who you are. And that, I could never allow. The truth is, David doesn't see me anymore. He sees a burden. He sees someone he'll eventually have to take care of. Brenda? She sees a prop. A lonely old woman they can parade around to prove how caring they are. They don't hear the strength in my voice, or notice the steady way I manage my affairs, or the pride I take in keeping Thomas's house alive. At family dinners, it's always the same script. Brenda fawning over her achievements, David nodding along, while I'm treated like a guest in my own story. "How's the garden, Mom?" asked in the same tone you'd use with a child showing you a crayon drawing. When I say I fixed the broken faucet myself, Brenda's lips twitch into a pitying smile, as though I told her I tried to lift a truck. Do you know how humiliating it is to have your own family dismiss your independence as foolishness? To have your strength twisted into a weakness? I'll tell you, it's worse than being mocked by strangers. Strangers don't know you. Family should. I folded the invitation and set it back on the table. A calmness settled over me. I realized then that this party wasn't going to be their stage. It was going to be mine. If they wanted a spectacle, I'd give them one they'd never forget. I whispered into the silence. A big outing, you say, Brenda? You have no idea how big it's going to be. The following days passed in their usual rhythm, but the bitterness of Brenda's words stayed with me. Every time I brewed a cup of tea or watered the roses, her note echoed in my head, a big outing. Such a simple phrase, yet heavy with mockery. It wasn't the first time, of course. At last year's Thanksgiving, Brenda had leaned across the table, her smile too sweet to be real, and told everyone how brave I was for managing in that creaky old house all by myself. Brave. As though I were tiptoeing through danger every day, instead of living a life I'd chosen. My cousins gave me pitying looks, the kind reserved for someone struggling to keep up. No one noticed the way my jaw tightened, or how I changed the subject just to end the humiliation. They all believe solitude is misery. They don't understand that my house isn't just four walls. It's a map of my life. The kitchen floor still has scratches from when David used to run his toy truck too wildly. The armchair by the window still carries Thomas's scent, faint but comforting. The garden blooms every spring because I care for it with my own two hands. To walk away from this place would be like cutting away half of myself. Sometimes the silence aches. I won't deny it. On long winter evenings, I find myself talking to Thomas as if he's still here. But loneliness doesn't equal helplessness. And my family's refusal to see that, well, that has been the cruelest cut of all. I thought again of Thomas, of how he used to believe in me without question. You've got more grit than you think, Ellie, he'd tell me when life felt heavy. That grit had carried me through 7 years without him. It had kept the roof solid, the bills paid, the roses alive. And now, it would carry me through something far greater, showing my family the truth. So, as I sat by the window with the invitation in my hand, I made a promise to myself. I would not shuffle into that anniversary party as the pitted widow. I would not be their prop, their proof of kindness. If Brenda wanted a frail spectacle, she would leave that ballroom disappointed. No, I would walk in with strength, with dignity, and with a secret that would make their laughter stop cold in their throats. I smiled then, the kind of smile I hadn't felt in years, the kind that spoke of resolve. The party would not be theirs. It would be mine. The morning after I made my decision, the air outside carried that sharp New England bite, the kind that makes you pull your cardigan tighter around your shoulders. I stood at the window, watching the trees sway against a pale sky, and thought about how many storms this house had weathered, and how many more it would withstand, just like me. David called, as he always did on Sundays. Mom, have you given more thought to Whispering Pines? His tone was practiced, each word carefully arranged to sound caring, though I could hear the impatience tucked underneath. It's safe there. You'll have people around you. You won't have to worry about bills or repairs. David, I interrupted gently, I'm doing just fine here. He sighed. That heavy, disappointed sigh that says more than words ever could. You just don't see it, Mom. You're all alone in that big house. It's too much for you. I bit back the words rising in my throat. Too much for me? This house had been my strength for 7 years. I tended every corner of it, managed every detail, kept it alive while they dismissed me as incapable. Brenda's voice followed not long after. She called under the pretense of checking in, but slipped her usual jab into the conversation. Eleanor, dear, I hope you're not still fussing with that faucet. That's a man's job, really. You should just leave those things. You'll only make it harder for yourself. I smiled into the receiver, my lips curving even as irritation flared inside me. The faucet is fine, Brenda. You don't need to worry about me. What I didn't tell her was that her words had lit a fire in me. Every dismissal, every patronizing sigh, every pitying glance had stacked up like kindling, and now the flame had caught. When Thomas was alive, he always reminded me that dignity isn't handed to you, it's claimed. That thought played over and over in my mind as I set the invitation back down on the table. Brenda thought the anniversary would be my grand outing, proof that I could still walk into a ballroom without collapsing. But she was wrong. It wouldn't be my outing. It would be my stage. I decided in that moment. I would go. but not as the woman they expected. Not as their fragile, pitted matriarch. I would arrive with a secret that would shift the balance entirely. A reminder that Eleanor was not fading. She was preparing. The echoes of their laughter had stung me long enough. At that party, their laughter would stop. Once my decision was made, a new kind of energy settled over me. It was as if I had been walking through fog for years, and suddenly, the sky cleared. My days had meaning again, not the dull rhythm of chores and quiet evenings, but a sense of purpose. I began by visiting the bank. Walking through those glass doors, I felt the same nerves I'd felt decades earlier when Thomas and I applied for our first mortgage. But this time, I was walking in alone, armed not with fear, but with determination. The branch manager, Miss Davies, looked surprised to see me. We'd known each other for years, though mostly through small transactions and polite exchanges. "Eleanor," she said warmly, "it's been a while. What brings you in today?" I steadied my voice. "I'd like to discuss opening an investment account." "A significant one." Her eyebrows lifted. "Of course. Let's step into my office." As I explained my plan, I watched her expression shift from curiosity to astonishment. Most women my age come in asking about consolidating savings or arranging for simpler banking. I was asking about property, contracts, and business growth. She leaned back in her chair, finally nodding slowly. "Eleanor, this is bold. Are you certain?" "I've never been more certain in my life," I replied. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for years without realizing it. Long ago, Thomas and I had set aside what he liked to call our escape hatch fund, savings we rarely touched, hidden from day-to-day budgets, meant for opportunities or emergencies. After his passing, I'd left it untouched, too heavy with memories. But now, that fund was becoming the key to proving my strength. Not long after, I found the property. It wasn't in Newton where I lived, but 2 towns over in Brookline. The house stood tall but weary, with peeling paint and a yard left wild for too long. To most, it looked like a burden waiting to swallow money whole. To me, it looked like possibility. I contacted a real estate lawyer recommended by a woman at the community center. Young, sharp, eager. He didn't look at me like an old lady chasing a fantasy. He looked at me like a client with vision. That, in itself, was refreshing. The purchase went through quickly, thanks to the savings Thomas and I had protected all those years. Signing the papers, I felt a rush of exhilaration. For the first time in years, I wasn't simply keeping life afloat. I was steering it. Of course, I told no one. When David called, I answered with calm small talk. "I've been keeping busy," I said, which was true. He just didn't know how busy. When Brenda rang to ask if I'd managed to fix that faucet without breaking the pipes, I simply laughed softly and reassured her everything was fine. Let them believe I was pottering about the house. The less they knew, the better. The first time I stepped into the Brookline house, I carried a small notebook under my arm and a pen in my hand. The place smelled of dust and forgotten years, the kind of smell that makes most buyers turn and run. But I walked through each room with steady steps, scribbling notes, already imagining what it could become. The cracked tiles, the sagging wallpaper, the drafty windows, all of it looked less like decay and more like opportunity. I started making calls. A contractor came first. He was a man in his 50s, seasoned but approachable, with a handshake that spoke of years of honest work. He studied the house with sharp eyes, pointing out what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. When I told him my vision, he paused, then gave me a slow nod. "Most folks wouldn't take this on," he said. "But if you've got the will, we can make it shine." That was the moment I realized something. While my own family saw me as fragile, strangers, professionals who worked with visionaries and builders every day, treated me as capable. They didn't talk down to me. They didn't sigh in pity. They saw me as a woman who knew her mind. Next came an interior designer, a young woman with sketches tucked under her arm and eyes that lit up as I described my ideas. We spread her drawings out on the dusty kitchen counter, papers curling at the edges. She didn't once suggest I was out of touch or incapable. Instead, she leaned closer, pointing at colors, textures, layouts. "This could be extraordinary," she said. For weeks, My days filled with meetings, phone calls, and long evenings with blueprints spread across my dining table. I used rideshare apps to travel back and forth, ignoring the protests of my knees and the stiffness in my fingers. Every appointment, every signed contract, was another reminder. I was not the frail woman Brenda made me out to be. I was a leader, managing something bigger than they could imagine. But it wasn't easy. By the end of some nights, I would sink into Thomas's old chair, my body aching, hands trembling from the strain. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that I was too old for this, that I should rest and leave bold projects to the young. Yet each morning, when I stood at the window with my tea, looking out at the house across town in my mind, the doubts faded. Purpose carried me forward. Meanwhile, David's calls kept coming. His questions were routine. Had I thought about Whispering Pines? Was I eating well? Did I remember to lock my doors? He never once asked what dreams I might still hold, what plans I might still be capable of. And Brenda, with her syrupy sighs, never missed the chance to remind me that the world saw me as brave for simply existing. If only they knew the truth. The work began in earnest. The sound of hammers, saws, and voices filled the old Brookline house each day, transforming the quiet decay into a place brimming with possibility. I visited often, sometimes twice in one day, watching walls stripped bare and rebuilt, listening to plans being debated and solutions discovered. The pace was grueling, not just for the crew but for me as well. I pushed through long hours, walking across uneven floors, climbing staircases that had yet to be reinforced. My arthritis protested with every step, my fingers stiffening when I tried to jot down notes. At night, I lay in bed, my body aching from head to toe, but I refused to let pain dictate the terms of my life. On more than one occasion, I asked myself if I was overreaching. Was this too much for someone my age? Should I have left the bold moves to others? Yet each time that thought flickered, another voice cut through it. Thomas's voice, steady and sure. "You've got grit, Ellie. Don't forget it." That memory alone was enough to get me out of bed each morning, to put on my coat, grab my notebook, and head back to the Brookline house. Every day I arrived, the crew greeted me not with pity, but with respect. They listened to my opinions, adjusted plans when I insisted, and even asked for my approval before finalizing details. They treated me as a partner, not as someone to be humored. Meanwhile, the secrecy was both exhausting and thrilling. When David called to check in, I would sit at my kitchen table with renovation contracts spread all around me, covering them quickly with a tea towel before answering. "How are you keeping busy, Mom?" he asked one evening. "Oh, just reading, cooking a little, enjoying the garden," I replied smoothly. If only he knew that at that very moment, my dining table was buried under tile samples and cost estimates. Brenda was worse. One afternoon she chirped through the phone, "Eleanor, do try not to wear yourself out before the party. It'll be such a big night for you." Her words carried the same sickly sweetness as spoiled fruit. I forced a polite laugh. "Don't worry, Brenda. I'll be ready." The truth was, every reminder of that anniversary fueled me further. With each brick laid, each wall repainted, I thought about the expression on her face when she realized what I'd been doing all along. She believed I was sitting alone in my house, knitting away the days until someone took pity and dragged me to Whispering Pines. She had no idea I was preparing something far greater. And so the weeks slipped by. The house began to shine with possibility, and though my body felt the weight of each passing day, my spirit grew stronger. The anniversary was no longer a date circled on the calendar. It was a deadline, and I would be ready. By late autumn, the Brookline house no longer looked like a forgotten relic. Fresh paint covered its walls, the roof no longer sagged, and new windows brought light into rooms that had once been dim and lifeless. The transformation was remarkable, but it came at a cost, not just in dollars but in my strength. Some mornings, I struggled to button my blouse because my fingers felt too stiff. Some evenings, I sat in my car after leaving the site, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands, gathering enough energy to drive home. There were nights when the loneliness pressed heavier than usual, and I wished Thomas were there to share the burden. But each time fatigue tempted me to stop, I reminded myself why I was doing this. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about dignity. About showing my son and his wife that the woman they mocked wasn't fading away. She was building something that would outlast every dismissive sigh, every patronizing comment. I remember one particular day, standing in what would soon be the dining room. Sunlight poured through the new windows, catching on the dust still swirling from the contractor's work. One of the younger workers paused, wiping his brow, and looked at me. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I hope I've got half your energy when I'm your age. You've got drive most people my age don't even have." That single sentence carried me for weeks. While my family treated me as fragile, strangers could see the truth. At home, David and Brenda remained oblivious. They spoke often about how lonely I must be. Brenda even called one evening to tell me she'd spoken to someone at Whispering Pines and they had a perfect unit ready whenever I wanted it. I smiled quietly, holding the phone to my ear, while at that very moment, my contractor was emailing me the schedule for the final round of inspections on the Brookline property. Their blindness became my strength. The less they knew, the bigger the shock would be. Eleanor pushed through her arthritis, her sleepless nights, and all the whispers against her, just to prove she was stronger than they ever believed. Now let me ask you if you're hearing this and you're still not subscribed. Why? Don't you want to stand with women like her? Women who refuse to be written off? If not, at least share your reason in the comments. I'm curious. The project was nearing its final stages. The walls gleamed, the floors shone, and the once wild yard had been tamed into order. Yet, even as excitement bubbled in me, a new tension grew. Would everything be complete in time for the anniversary? The invitations had been sent weeks ago. The date loomed closer and closer, each day tightening the knot in my chest. This was no longer just about finishing renovations. It was about the reveal. As the calendar crept toward December, my days blurred into one another. Morning coffee turned into site visits turned into late-night calls with the lawyer, and the lawyer's calls were followed by evenings spent poring over invoices at my dining table. My body protested more than ever, but my mind had never been sharper. The closer the anniversary drew, the more urgent everything felt. Every delay, every minor hiccup, carried the weight of the deadline. One afternoon, the contractor told me a shipment of fixtures had been delayed. For a brief moment, I felt the world tilt. What if the work wasn't finished on time? What if Brenda stood at that microphone, pity dripping from her words, while my secret sat unfinished across town? But the crew pulled through. They worked longer hours, often staying past dark, their determination feeding mine. They didn't see me as an old woman clinging to a dream. They saw me as their leader. And I, in turn, treated them like family, with gratitude, respect, and trust. At night, when the house was quiet, I would sit in Thomas's chair and imagine the look on Brenda's face when I revealed everything. I pictured David's stunned silence, the whispers rippling through the crowd, the shift in the room as pity turned to. That thought carried me through the exhaustion. Still, secrecy was the hardest part. Brenda had begun calling more frequently, no doubt curious about what I was doing with myself. Her words were layered with false concern, but her eyes, I could almost see them through the phone, were scanning for weakness, for proof that I was slipping. One evening, she said, "Eleanor, don't overexert yourself before the party. You don't want to tire yourself out. Leave the heavy lifting to the young." I bit back a laugh. If only she knew that just hours earlier, I had been standing in a construction zone, walking the crew through paint samples and flooring options, my hands smudged with dust from handling material boards. By the final week, the house no longer resembled the wreck I had first walked into. It was transformed, modern, warm, inviting. Every detail reflected not just my taste, but my determination. A brass key rested in a velvet case on my dresser, the symbol of what I had accomplished. The night before the anniversary, I laid out my gown, a deep green silk Thomas once told me matched my eyes. I studied myself in the mirror, and for the first time in years, I didn't see a widow or a woman pitted by her family. I saw Eleanor, capable, strong, and ready. The countdown was over. Tomorrow, the secret would become the truth. The morning of the anniversary arrived with an unusual stillness. I woke before dawn, the house quiet around me, the air holding that sharp winter chill that seeps into your bones. I made tea and stood at the window, watching the first light of day creep across the yard. It struck me then how far I had come, not just with the Brookline house, but within myself. Every ache in my joints, every sleepless night, every hour spent hiding papers when the phone rang, it had all led here. This was the day I would walk into that ballroom not as their frail matriarch, but as the woman who had outsmarted their pity. I dressed slowly, carefully, savoring each step of the ritual. The silk gown slid over my shoulders, the fabric cool against my skin. I pinned my hair back, added a touch of makeup, and slipped into shoes that had been waiting in my closet for years. Looking into the mirror, I didn't see someone preparing for a big outing. I saw a woman about to take command of a stage. Brenda had called the night before, her tone dripping with that familiar condescension. "Remember, Eleanor, it's black tie. Don't fuss with your hair too much, and keep it simple. We don't want you to tire yourself out." I had smiled into the phone, biting back the laughter rising in my throat. "Of course, Brenda. I'll keep it simple." If only she knew what simple meant to me. When the taxi arrived, I stepped outside with a steady gait, clutching my small velvet bag where the key rested. The driver glanced at the address and raised his eyebrows. "Brookline Country Club, huh? Big night out." I gave him a small, knowing smile. "You could say that." As the car carried me through the quiet streets, I thought of Thomas again. I could almost hear his voice, teasing and proud. "Give them a show they'll never forget, Ellie." And I knew he would have stood beside me, hand in mine, proud of the strength I'd found in the years since he'd been gone. The country club loomed ahead, its lights glowing against the dark winter sky, cars lined up at the entrance, laughter spilling out of the grand hall. My heart beat steady, not with nerves, but with anticipation. They had no idea. To them, I was still the woman living alone, waiting for her family to decide her future. Tonight, I would prove them wrong. Tonight, I would silence the laughter. I stepped out of the taxi, smoothed my gown, and walked toward the entrance. The doorman opened the glass doors, and as I crossed the threshold, I carried with me not just years of memories and grief, but something far more powerful, the truth I was about to reveal. The stage was set. The Brookline Country Club gleamed like a jewel against the December night, its entrance lit with golden lights that shimmered across polished cars pulling up one after the other. Guests in gowns and tuxedos flowed through the doors, their laughter mingling with the sound of music drifting from inside. It was the kind of place designed to impress, a fortress of wealth and reputation. I stepped out of the taxi, gathering my gown as the cold air pressed against me. The emerald fabric shimmered faintly under the lights, and for a brief moment, I caught a few curious glances. No one expected the widow, the woman they whispered about, to arrive looking like she belonged among them. Inside, the hall glowed with chandeliers, their light bouncing off crystal glasses and polished silver. Waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne. The air was thick with perfume, the clink of glasses, the low hum of conversations layered with polite laughter. I checked my coat and straightened my posture. Tonight wasn't about fading into a corner. Tonight, I was here to be seen. David and Brenda stood near the bar, their smiles wide and rehearsed, greeting guests as though they were royalty. Brenda's silver gown clung too tightly, the sequins flashing under the lights. Her eyes swept over me as I approached, and for the first time, her smile faltered. "Eleanor," she exclaimed, her voice just a touch too high. "You made it. How wonderful." David hugged me quickly, his hand patting my back as though I were a child. "Mom, you look great. So good to see you out of the house." I gave him a measured smile, letting the words roll off me. Out of the house. As though I'd been hibernating, waiting for their invitation to breathe fresh air. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk. I sat with distant cousins, pleasant people who clearly had been instructed to keep me company. They asked polite questions, nodded at my short answers, and quickly turned to safer topics. I ate in silence, watching Brenda glide around the room, collecting admiration like coins in a jar. At last, the speeches began. David took the microphone first, his voice warm as he praised Brenda, their marriage, their family. Guests smiled, clapping at his words, though I noticed he never once glanced my way. Then Brenda took her turn. She clasped the microphone delicately, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion. She spoke of her devotion to David, of their years together, of the love that carried them through. And then, inevitably, she turned to me. "And of course, I must thank my dear mother-in-law, Eleanor," she said, her tone lowering into that syrupy pity she used so well. "It's so brave of her to be here tonight. Living all alone in that big house can't be easy. She's such an inspiration, proof of the quiet strength of our elders." The room responded with gentle applause, a murmur of approval. A few guests even turned to smile at me with pity in their eyes. My chest tightened, not from shame, but from fury held carefully in check. It was time. I rose slowly from my chair, the scrape of the chair legs against the polished floor drawing curious glances from the nearby tables. My cousins exchanged confused looks as I stepped away, my gown sweeping across the carpet. Brenda froze, her confident smile wavering as I approached the stage. "Eleanor? What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice thin but audible enough to betray her unease. I didn't answer. I reached for the microphone in her hand, my fingers steady, my gaze locked on hers. For the first time in years, she looked unsure of herself. The music faded, the chatter died, and the room fell into an expectant hush. I cleared my throat softly, the sound sharp in the silence. "Thank you, Brenda, for your kind words," I began, my voice clear and steady. "It means so much to know I'm considered brave for managing to live in my own home." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the audience, though I could feel the discomfort simmering just beneath it. I let the moment stretch, then continued. "Many of you may see me as lonely, fragile perhaps. Someone waiting for the day when others will decide my future for me." I paused, scanning the faces turned toward me. "But you see, that isn't my reality. My life has not been spent waiting. My life has been spent building." Brenda's smile had hardened into something brittle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. David had risen from his chair, hovering near the stage, unsure whether to intervene. I drew a breath and let the next words fall with deliberate weight. While my family assumed I was struggling to maintain my independence, I was working on something extraordinary. For the past 6 months, I have been busy with a project of my own. The audience stirred, whispers fluttering like wings across the room. "I purchased a property not far from here," I said, my eyes sweeping over the crowd. "An abandoned house that many dismissed as hopeless. But I didn't see hopelessness. I saw potential. And over these months, I've rebuilt it, renewed it, and given it a new purpose." I reached into the small velvet clutch at my side and held up a brass key that gleamed under the lights. The room gasped in unison, the sound sharp and immediate. "This," I said, my voice lifting, "is the key to what I call the Eleanor House. It will not be my residence. It will be a sanctuary for women like me, women who wish to remain independent, who want community without condescension, who demand respect without pity. It will be a home where dignity is not sacrificed, but celebrated." For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Dozens of faces stared, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Even David had frozen, his expression suspended somewhere between confusion and disbelief. I let the silence stretch, letting every eye rest on the key glittering in my hand. My heart thumped, steady and calm. For years I had been spoken for, pitted, dismissed. Tonight, my voice filled the room, and no one dared to interrupt. "I know what some of you are thinking," I continued, lowering the key but keeping it visible. "You're wondering how a woman my age could manage such a project. You may even assume someone else did it for me. But make no mistake, this was my vision, my effort, and my decision. The same woman you thought couldn't handle a faucet has built a place that will change lives." A murmur rippled through the tables. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned in, eager to hear more. I caught sight of Brenda's face. Her painted smile had collapsed entirely. She looked pale, almost trembling, her hand clutching the microphone stand as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. "And to my dear family," I said, turning my gaze directly toward David and Brenda, "I want to thank you. Truly. Because it was your doubt, your whispers, and your constant underestimation that fueled me. Every sigh of pity, every suggestion that I was ready for a home I did not choose, all of it reminded me to prove you wrong." The audience gasped softly. David's face flushed crimson as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I am not here tonight as your burden, I declared, my voice ringing clear. I am here as a woman who has taken her independence and turned it into something greater. The Eleanor house will be a place of pride, where strength is honored, not dismissed. Where age is not an ending, but a beginning. I lifted the key once more, holding it high above my head. This is not just a symbol of what I've built. It is proof that you cannot measure a woman's worth by her years, or by how quiet her house may seem. You measure it by her courage to keep creating, to keep living, to keep building, no matter who doubts her. The room remained hushed, as though every guest was holding their breath. Forks rested untouched on plates, glasses hung suspended in hands. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with stillness. I placed the key back into my clutch and returned the microphone to the stand. My final words were softer, but carried even further because of the silence. Thank you for listening. I'll leave you to your celebration now. I stepped down from the stage without looking back at Brenda or David. My gown trailed behind me as I crossed the ballroom floor, and with each step, I felt years of dismissal falling away. I had come as their frail widow. I was leaving as Eleanor, unbroken, undeniable, and triumphant. The ballroom was frozen as I walked away from the stage. I didn't hurry. I wanted every step to sink into their minds, a reminder that the woman they had pitted had just shifted the ground beneath their feet. At my table, my cousins stared wide-eyed, mouths slightly parted. One of them whispered, "I had no idea," but her voice trailed off as I passed. No one clapped, no one cheered, but that was better. Silence has a weight all its own, heavier than applause. I caught a glimpse of David. He stood rigid, his face pale, lips parted as though searching for words. Brenda's hand was on his arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. Her carefully sculpted smile had shattered, leaving only raw disbelief. I reached the door without looking back. My heart was steady, not racing. Triumph doesn't need a pounding drumbeat. It needs stillness, the quiet certainty that the world has shifted in your favor. Outside the ballroom, I handed my ticket to the coat attendant. As I slipped my arms into the sleeves, I heard the murmurs begin behind me. The whispers that would ripple through that hall for the rest of the evening. The questions, the disbelief. I knew the conversations would carry on for weeks. But for me, it was finished. I had spoken my truth, held up my key, and left them to sit with their own shame. I stepped into the night, the winter air biting my cheeks. The taxi was already waiting, engine humming. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror as I settled into the seat. "Good evening, ma'am." "Big party." I smiled, leaning back against the seat. You could say that. As the car pulled away from the glowing country club, I turned my gaze to the dark streets passing by. For the first time in years, I felt completely in control. No pity, no sighs, no whispered doubts could erase what I had built. The Eleanor house was real, standing strong just a few streets away, waiting for its doors to open. When Eleanor held up those keys, she wasn't just proving her strength. She was proving the strength of every woman who refuses to shrink. And honestly, if that moment didn't convince you to subscribe already, maybe this channel isn't for you. Or is it? If you're unsure, go to the comments and tell us what's stopping you. Maybe you'll surprise yourself. The ride home felt like a victory lap. Every streetlight I passed seemed to shine brighter, every mile taking me further from their condescension. By the time I stepped through the front door of my own house, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like triumph. When I arrived home, the house was dark, waiting for me as it always did. I turned the key in the lock, stepped inside, and set my clutch on the entry table. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the silence wrap around me. But tonight, it didn't feel like the emptiness my family imagined. It felt like strength. I slipped off my gown and draped it carefully over a chair. Then, still in my stockings, I walked to the living room and sat in Thomas's old armchair. The key to the Eleanor house rested in my palm, cool and solid, proof that this was no dream. I thought back to the faces in that ballroom, the widened eyes, the parted lips, the silence that fell heavy as I spoke. They had expected a fragile woman offering polite thanks for being pitted. Instead, they had witnessed a declaration, a reclamation of dignity they never believed I had. I wondered what David was saying at that very moment, how Brenda was spinning the story to salvage her pride. But I didn't linger on them. Their opinions no longer held weight. What mattered was the truth. I had spoken, and they had listened. The room around me felt alive with memory. Thomas's presence seemed closer than it had in years. I could almost hear his chuckle, the warmth in his voice. "That's my Ellie. You showed them." For the first time since his passing, I didn't feel the hollow ache of absence. I felt partnership, not in body, but in spirit. The strength he once reminded me I had was now flowing through me, undeniable and unshakable. I leaned back in the chair, exhaustion finally pressing down after the adrenaline of the night. Yet beneath the weariness was a deep satisfaction, the kind that no amount of applause could provide. I hadn't just silenced the mocking. I had rewritten my story. The house creaked as it always did in the night, but instead of reminding me of loneliness, it reminded me of endurance. This home had stood through storms, through loss, through years of doubt. And so had I. Upstairs, I placed the brass key on my nightstand before slipping into bed. My eyes closed easily, without the usual tossing and turning. Tomorrow would bring phone calls, questions, and perhaps confrontation. But tonight, I rested in peace, knowing that I had proven myself not only to them, but to me. Sleep came swiftly, carrying me into dreams not of the past, but of the future, of a house in Brookline filled with women like me, strong and unafraid, walking hallways built on dignity. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I felt powerful. The phone began ringing before I had even finished breakfast. I ignored it, sipping my tea slowly, savoring the stillness of the morning. By the third call, the voicemail was full of David's voice, panicked, pleading, demanding. I knew what would come next, and I wasn't wrong. A little after 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, David pushed past me without waiting for an invitation. His suit from the night before was rumpled, his tie loose, his eyes bloodshot as though he hadn't slept. Brenda trailed behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her face a mask of barely contained fury. "Mom, what was that last night?" David's voice was tight, almost frantic. "Why didn't you tell us? Do you have any idea what you've done?" I closed the door gently and turned to face them, my expression calm. "Yes, David. I know exactly what I've done." Brenda threw her hands up. "A business? At your age? You've tied up everything in some project you can't possibly manage. Do you understand what this means? You could lose everything. Everything your husband worked for. Everything we were going to use to take care of you." Her words were sharp, but I caught the slip. "We were going to use. Not you were going to need. Not we wanted to help." It was about them. It had always been about them. I walked past them into the living room, gesturing for them to follow. On the coffee table sat a neat folder, waiting for this very moment. "You think I don't understand?" I said evenly, settling into Thomas's armchair. "I understand better than you imagine. Which is why I had my lawyer prepare documents months ago. I wanted everything to be crystal clear." I slid the folder across the table toward David. He hesitated, then opened it. His eyes scanned the page, confusion twisting into disbelief. Brenda leaned over his shoulder, her face draining of color as she read. The paper laid out a trust. All proceeds from the Eleanor house, its profits, its growth, its legacy, were to be placed in a managed account, distributed only for the education and well-being of my grandchildren and for charitable causes I had specified. David and Brenda were explicitly excluded. David's jaw tightened. "Mom, you can't do this." "I already have," I replied softly. "You thought I was building this only for me. You thought I was clinging to pride. But I was building something that will outlast me, something that cannot be swallowed by your expectations or your inheritance." Brenda's lips parted, but no words came. For once, her endless commentary failed her. David slammed the folder shut and shoved it back across the table as though the paper itself had stung him. "This isn't fair," he said, his voice rising. "You're cutting us out completely? After everything we've done for you?" I raised an eyebrow, folding my hands in my lap. "Everything you've done for me? What exactly would that be, David? The endless suggestions about selling the house Thomas and I built? The reminders that I should be shipped off to Whispering Pines? Or the pity you let Brenda parade around at every gathering? He opened his mouth, then shut it again. Brenda stepped forward, her voice sharp and trembling. We were only trying to help. You don't know how reckless this looks. A retirement home? Do you realize how much work that is? You're going to drive yourself into the ground. And what happens when you can't manage anymore? I looked up at her steadily. That's the difference between you and me, Brenda. You see my age as the end of the road. I see it as freedom. I've already planned for the future. The business will be managed professionally, by people who respect what it stands for. And when I'm gone, it will keep going, not for you, but for my grandchildren. For their education, for their chance at life, and for women who need a place where they aren't dismissed for growing older. Brenda's face twisted. So we get nothing? After all these years? After the way we've looked after you? I laughed then, the sound surprising even me, not bitter, but almost joyous. Looked after me? Brenda, you've spent years making me a spectacle. You never looked after me. You looked after your image. And you wanted what you thought was waiting for you in my bank account. Well, that account has been emptied into something better. David rubbed his temples, his shoulders sagging as though the fight had drained from him. Mom, this isn't like you. Dad would never have. I cut him off gently, my voice low but sharp. Don't you dare speak for Thomas. He knew me better than anyone. He trusted me to make decisions, and he would have stood by this one. In fact, it was Thomas who insisted we save the money I used. He called it our escape hatch. And thanks to him, I had what I needed to prove my strength. The room fell quiet. The ticking of the old clock on the mantel filled the space between us. David slumped onto the sofa, staring blankly at the folder. Brenda stood stiff, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed, but behind the anger, I saw something else, fear. Because Brenda knew what was coming next. I studied Brenda's face carefully. Her anger looked forced, her words rehearsed, but her eyes gave her away. Behind the fury was something brittle, something cracking under the weight of truth she feared I would speak aloud. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Brenda, I said quietly, you've always underestimated me. You thought I was too distracted, too fragile to notice the things happening around me. But you were wrong. I notice everything. Her expression faltered, just for a moment. David looked up, confused. What are you talking about? I turned my gaze to him, steady and unflinching. Your wife. The secrets she thought I'd never see. The phone calls. The little absences. The way she looked at your father when she thought no one was watching. David's brow furrowed. He shook his head slowly. No, Mom, don't do this. Don't make things up. Brenda's hand shot out, gripping his arm tightly. She's confused, Brenda said quickly, her voice cracking. She doesn't know what she's saying. I let out a long breath, then reached into the drawer beside me. From it, I pulled a thin folder, one I had kept hidden for years. Inside were letters, receipts, and most damning of all, a single printed email from Ms. Davies at the bank. She had documented Brenda's repeated attempts to pry into my finances, dressed up as concern for my reckless spending. I slid the email across the table. She's been trying to get information about my accounts for months. But that's not the real betrayal, David. That's only the symptom. His eyes darted to the page, scanning quickly, then lifting to his wife. Brenda, what is this? Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face. I pressed on, my voice firm. The truth is, David, your father told me before he died. He confessed to me about Brenda. About the affair. I knew before the end. That's why he created the Escape Hatch Fund, separate from everything else. It wasn't just savings. It was protection from them. From her. The silence that followed was unlike any other. It wasn't the silence of shock in a ballroom, or the silence of pity at family dinners. This was the silence of truth crashing down like a storm. David stared at Brenda, his face frozen, his mouth working but no words escaping. Brenda sank into a chair, her hands covering her face, her shoulders trembling. The woman who had mocked me, paraded her pity, and treated me like a burden now looked smaller than I had ever seen her. I sat back calm, watching the two of them struggle under the weight of revelations they could no longer deny. You mocked me for being alone, I said softly. But solitude gave me clarity. It gave me freedom. And it gave me the chance to build a legacy you'll never touch. For several long minutes, the only sound in the room was the old clock ticking steadily on the mantel. David sat with his head in his hands, unable to look at either of us. Brenda remained slumped in the chair, her fingers clutching her temples as though she could block out the truth with sheer force of will. I stood and crossed to the window, pulling back the curtain to let in the pale winter light. The garden outside, bare and quiet, looked peaceful. It reminded me that peace is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of clarity. Turning back to them, I said, "For years, you treated me like a child. A fragile thing to be managed, directed, pitted. But tonight you see me as I am. I am not helpless. I am not lonely. I am not waiting for anyone to decide my fate." David finally looked up, his eyes red. "Mom, why didn't you say anything sooner? Why let me live in the dark?" "Because it wasn't my secret to tell," I replied softly. "It was hers. And your father's. I had hoped you would discover it on your own, but perhaps you were too busy believing the image Brenda painted for you. Either way, I knew that one day, truth has a way of surfacing." Brenda shifted, her voice breaking. You can't do this to us. You can't just cut us out. We're your family." I shook my head. Family isn't determined by marriage certificates or blood alone. Family is respect, trust, and care. You mocked me, dismissed me, and tried to strip away my dignity. That's not family. That's opportunism. And opportunism has no place in my future. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, spreading outward until the room itself seemed heavier. Yet within me, I felt lighter than I had in years. I gathered the folder from the coffee table, tucking it neatly back into the drawer. "You may leave now," I said gently. "You have your answers. Nothing more needs to be said." David hesitated, his lips trembling as though he wanted to protest, but the fight had drained from him. He stood, shoulders slumped, and walked toward the door. Brenda followed, her steps unsteady, her face pale. When the door closed behind them, the house was silent again. But this silence was not heavy or suffocating. It was cleansing. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on me, no shadow of expectation or pity. I walked through the house slowly, running my hand along the walls, the furniture, the memories. This house had carried me through storms, through loneliness, through the loss of Thomas. Now, it carried me into freedom. The Eleanor house was more than a business. It was a declaration. And now that it stood ready to open its doors, I finally felt ready to live without apology. The weeks that followed were not without their storms. David called less often, his words clipped and uncertain when he did. Brenda avoided me entirely, no doubt nursing her pride and scrambling to repair the cracks in her marriage. I didn't seek them out. My energy belonged elsewhere. The renovations finished at last, and the Eleanor house opened its doors. Walking through its bright halls, I felt a surge of pride. The polished floors, the warm colors on the walls, the inviting sitting rooms. It was everything I had envisioned on that very first day when I stepped into the dust and shadows. Only now it was alive. The first resident arrived on a crisp Saturday morning. Her name was Margaret, a retired teacher with kind eyes and a voice that carried both warmth and authority. I greeted her at the door, handing her the brass key I had once held up in that crowded ballroom. She took it with trembling hands. "I can't believe this is mine," she whispered. "A place where I can belong without feeling small." Tears pricked my eyes. "It's not just yours, Margaret. It's ours. A place where we live on our own terms." As I walked her through the house, the garden where women could plant flowers, the library lined with books, the spacious dining room that would soon ring with laughter, I realized the true victory wasn't silencing Brenda or cutting off David's assumptions. It was this, creating something that gave other women the strength to stand taller, to refuse pity, to embrace their later years with pride. That evening, I stood outside the Eleanor house, watching the lights glow warmly through the windows. I thought of Thomas again, and for once, the memory didn't sting. It filled me with gratitude. His belief in me had carried me here, and I had carried it forward. I knew the whispers in my family would never fully stop. People would still judge, still question, still doubt. But their voices no longer mattered. I had built something real, something lasting. I had proven that strength doesn't fade with age. It sharpens. Back at my own home, I sat once more in Thomas's chair. The silence around me no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like possibility. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was living. Eleanor's story shows us that strength doesn't fade with age. It grows sharper. So I'll ask you kindly, are you going to walk away without subscribing after hearing this? Or will you stand with women like Eleanor and join our circle? If you're not ready, that's fine too. Go to the comments and share why. I'll be reading. I closed my eyes, smiling to myself. I was no longer the woman mocked for living alone. I was Eleanor, builder, survivor, and leader of something greater than myself. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone at all.